AFU is increasing pressure on the Dobropillia salient. This was stated by Alexander Syrsky, who inspected this section of the front. The commander-in-chief emphasized that assault units have advanced in certain directions. In total, 188 square kilometers of territory have been liberated during the operation, and active clearing of Russian occupiers continues north of Pokrovsk and in Myrnavred. The air assault forces noted that the Russian advance in these areas has been stopped. The enemy was also prevented from cutting the road connecting Pokrovsk and Rodinsk.
The situation in Hradna was tense but under control. Enemy forces have been detected on the approaches to the southeastern outskirts of Myrnavred. Their total number of personnel is small, about 10 soldiers. Efforts to eliminate them are ongoing. The city's defenses have been reinforced with additional forces. From the report of the 7th Rapid Response Corps of the Air Assault Forces of the AFU on Telegram.
Just in the Pokrovsk direction, since the beginning of the day, Ukrainian soldiers have repelled more than a third of all Russian attacks recorded on the front. An equal number were repelled in total in the Oleksandrivka, Kupiansk, Kostantinivka, and Lyman directions. The General Staff emphasized that the defense forces are steadfastly holding back the enemy's onslaught.
Armada.
As military experts note, Ukrainian soldiers continue to disrupt all plans of the Russians, who are unsuccessfully attempting to launch an offensive from the south and southwest in the hope that their 51st Army will capture Pokrovsk from the north.
Well, they kind of tried to chase two rabbits at once and decided to punch a sort of spike to the north toward Dobropillia. Basically, realizing that this would give them a chance to encircle the entire Kostantinivka Dobropillia group in the north. It didn't work out. The defense forces responded in time. Right now, basically, the elimination of this Dobropillia salient is being completed.
They also managed to disrupt the transfer of Russian troops from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk. According to the partisan movement Atish, a Russian military truck was set on fire by members of the 115th Separate Russian Motorized Rifle Brigade themselves. And in the Black Sea, the Ukrainian Navy successfully attacked the Sevast drilling platform, destroying not only an elite special unit of the Russian occupiers, but also Russian reconnaissance equipment and the crew of an anti-tank missile system. The Naval Command denied the claims made by Russian propaganda and noted that one of the strikes on the platform was carried out by a naval drone.
Trying to pass off yet another defeat as their own victory, the Russians are spreading a video allegedly showing the destruction of a Ukrainian Navy boat by a Lancet munition, when in reality, we successfully used a kamikaze drone against the drilling platform. From a statement by the Ukrainian Navy on Telegram.
Another 1,160 Russian occupiers were eliminated on the front lines over the past day. Thus, according to the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Russia's total combat losses since the start of the full-scale war have already exceeded 1,144,000 soldiers. In addition, 5 Russian tanks, 6 armored combat vehicles, 45 artillery systems, and more than 120 units of automotive equipment were destroyed yesterday.
Let's discuss Pokrovsk. Yurii Fedorenko, commander of the 429th Separate Unmanned Systems Regiment, a kill of the Ukrainian ground forces, joins us. Glad to have you, freedom. Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to Ukraine. Glad
to welcome you. Good day, brave heroes. Glory. So,
Yurii, you actually refuted it on my show when Putin made his statement and invited journalists to supposedly demonstrate the encirclement of Ukrainian troops. You completely debunked it and clearly explained why that couldn't possibly be true. Let's briefly start with an overall assessment of the situation at the front, especially, of course, in the Pokrovsk direction. The situation
is extremely difficult. That's absolutely clear, because the enemy is concentrating its maximum firepower, as well as a huge amount of manpower. We've probably talked about this on air before, but let's go over it again so our viewers understand just how intense the fighting is in the Dobropillia and Pokrovsk directions. If we take any other active direction where the enemy is trying to break through our defensive lines, in other areas we would see, over a 25-kilometer stretch of the front, anywhere from 50 to 150 recorded instances of enemy troop movements. specifically movements of their manpower. If we take that same stretch of the front in the Dobropillia or Pokrovsk direction, the number would be 500 or more. What does that mean? It means the enemy has pulled together everything possible specifically for this direction. Essentially, right now one of the main battles of the Russian-Ukrainian war is taking place in the Donetsk region. And as a result, the defense forces, who have fewer troops and resources, are managing to repel the enemy's attacks. This can be compared to a kind of breakwater. When a big wave comes crashing in and the breakwater smashes against the rocks, it's just like that. The Russian occupation forces are breaking against the armed forces of Ukraine, against the defense forces as a whole. And as a result, I am more than convinced that we will be able to accomplish the task set by the Supreme Commander-in-Chief and the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, and destroy the maximum number of enemy forces while carrying out these tasks. I'll tell you more. Some of the crews carrying out combat missions are also working with psychological support, because the number of enemy forces destroyed by each of our servicemen operating a drone system, or by each group, is very, very high. One way or another, you know that Ukrainians are kind people who are forced to fight for their land so that we are not destroyed. And of course, support is also necessary, because if, during one shift, a single crew destroys about 30 servicemen of the Russian State Army, and sometimes even more, you can imagine the impact. You understand that this is not only a physical strain, but also a psychological one. The enemy treats their own personnel like, well, I don't even know. You could say they treat them like cannon fodder, but I'll put it another way. For them, it's just material, expendable material. In Russian, it's called expendable material. They don't count their losses at all. I'll tell you more. There are constant reports of situations where the enemy gets trapped somewhere, and there are even cases of cannibalism. And this isn't something Yurii Fedorenko made up. These are facts that are documented and publicly available. Plus, very often, when an enemy soldier is wounded, they aren't evacuated. On the contrary, they're told to keep moving forward, and if they try to come back, they're punished very harshly for it, including with execution. In addition to all this, it often happens that the enemy ends up in a trap. Their superior officer, like their direct commander, company commander, or battalion commander, reports up the chain that the group has been destroyed. But then, that group manages to reappear in the rear areas. They were able to get out of the line of fire, escape the kill zone set up by the defense forces, and make their way back deeper into their own lines. Very often, they're just written off so that no one has to redo the paperwork. Like, they're gone and that's that, end of story. It's still a big mystery to me how Russians, even those who fight for money, and that's the majority, about 80% of those fighting against Ukraine, they're doing it for money. It's basically a contract between the Russian authorities and their population. They're being bought with so-called signing bonuses. First, they push their own people below rock bottom, drowning them in microloans and microcredits. And then, using the money they hand out, these people go off to fight against Ukraine. And in this context, they have a rough understanding of what's happening on the front lines. They know they'll be used as cannon fodder, but at the same time, they consciously go to kill Ukrainians. Anyone who comes to us with weapons will be disarmed and will end up buried in Ukrainian soil. Yurii.
Right now, there are street battles going on. From your perspective, what are the particular challenges and difficulties for drone operators working specifically in urban environments and city buildings?
Friend or foe, that's the main challenge for every drone operator. You have to be very careful, because as you know, the enemy disguises themselves as civilians. They dress in civilian clothes. And sometimes it can be very difficult to tell whether someone is an enemy if they aren't holding a weapon, or if they're actually Ukrainian citizens. But these groups also reveal themselves. I won't go into details about how, but it's absolutely obvious when they have weapons in their hands that they're the enemy. Actions are then taken to eliminate them. if we talk about the interaction between different structural units of the defense forces. As you understand, in order to stop the enemy during such a fierce onslaught against us, the defense forces have created many units. Every time, it's a big challenge for us to establish communication and cooperation. But over these almost 4 years of full-scale war, the defense forces have learned to cooperate at a high level. So, when it comes to drones, the main thing is to distinguish between friend and foe and to strike at the right moment, before the enemy infantryman opens fire on our group that's carrying out counter-sabotage operations. That's the foundation. And of course, as you can imagine, urban combat is always difficult. Urban combat forces you to use a large number of troops and resources, because every house, every corner could potentially be a hiding place for the enemy or for their sabotage and reconnaissance groups trying to infiltrate the city. The defense forces know their job well and carry it out quite effectively, not allowing the enemy to get drawn into the city itself or to encircle it from the flanks. But for our audience watching, who rely on public maps that more or less accurately reflect the situation in all respects, you just need to understand the intensity of the enemy's assault. They're coming out of every crack. And as a result, because Ukrainians support their army in the fight for life, because they understand that as long as our army stands, as long as people can work behind them, as long as people can remain free behind them. And this is one whole, both Ukrainian citizens and Ukrainian servicemen. As long as our people support us, I believe there are no impossible tasks for us, no unreachable lines we couldn't get to, everything in its own time. And we really hope that our partners will continue to increase both the pressure on the Russian Federation and the level of support for Ukraine, both financially and by providing weapons, including high-precision ones. In my opinion, you know, the situation that's unfolding now regarding the Tomahawks. Everyone went quiet. It was discussed very loudly at first, and then it kind of faded into the background. But the prospect hasn't gone anywhere. I believe that with European funding, we will be able to obtain a certain amount of high-precision weaponry. If it doesn't end up being Tomahawks, there are other good missiles, including those produced by European countries, that could help us dry out the enemy in their rear areas and destroy those facilities that produce the necessary weapons the enemy is using against the civilian Ukrainian population. These are the weapons that strike our residential buildings, children's hospitals, maternity wards, and other civilian infrastructure. We must do everything possible to break the enemy and drive them out. Right now, we are living through the next chapter in Ukraine's history, where we have the chance to correct all the failures of our grandfathers and great-grandfathers, who were unable to preserve Ukrainian statehood and ended up subjugated by the Russian Empire, the Russian Federation, and the Soviet Union. Now, we can shape things in such a way that, even though Russia will still exist, it won't even dare to think about attacking our country or killing Ukrainian civilians in the future. Everything is in our hands, and the key to victory isn't somewhere out there in Washington or in Germany. It's right here, inside each of us. As long as the defense forces are holding, as long as there is military and political backbone, the leadership of our country can accomplish the impossible work they are doing now, because uniting the world and getting help when people say one thing to your face and do another is an extremely tough challenge. Not everyone would be able to handle it. In my opinion, the current president of Ukraine is handling the tasks on his shoulders very, very well. And I'm not sure that anyone else, in such a difficult time and in such a high position, could moderate processes and unite Ukrainian society and the community of civilized countries as effectively. And
By the way, since we started talking about Tomahawks, well, there's some great news about Storm Shadow. So I think we'll be talking about Tomahawks in a more upbeat mood too, right? Remember how much effort took us to get the Leopards back in the day, right? But everything eventually ends well for Ukraine. And there's reason to believe that the same will be true for the end of the full-scale war. But let's move on from this positive note to the current situation. In Pokrovsk, near Myrnograd, There is a statement from the air assault forces of the armed forces of Ukraine that, thanks to the coordinated actions of the defense forces, the Russians' advance was stopped north of Pokrovsk and Myrnograd. And importantly, they did not allow the enemy to cut the road connecting Pokrovsk and Rodinsk. To counter the occupying army, the defense forces continue to bring in more assault units and special forces. We have a quote on this topic, and we'll discuss it after. The situation in Myrnograd is tense, but under control. Enemy forces have been detected on the approaches to the southeastern outskirts of Myrnograd. The total number of their personnel is small, about 10 soldiers. Efforts to eliminate them are ongoing. The city's defenses have been reinforced with additional forces. Let's discuss how important it is not to let the Russians cut off the road between the settlements right now, especially in the Pokrovsk direction. Does this mean that this is actually preventing the very encirclement that Putin would like to talk about, or not really?
Let me give you a simple example. In order for you to be able to salt borscht or any other dish you and your family like, you either need to produce the ingredients yourself, have your own garden, your own farm, or go to the store and buy them. Now imagine that the road to the store is blocked off, or the road to your own garden is blocked off. As a result, you won't be able to cook the dish you need. When we talk about military operations, we have to understand that logistics are the lifeblood of war. Without logistics, there's no way to maintain the group of troops carrying out missions in a given area. Why? Because logistics support the work of our artillery, our drone systems, our infantry units, and also enable critical evacuations that save the lives of our servicemen. That's why it's so important, through engineering structures, our drone systems, and other means available to the defense forces and the tactics of their use, to make logistics as protected as possible. The enemy is trying to cut it off, knowing that by blocking the main lifeblood of war, logistics, they gain a tactical advantage on the battlefield. That's why the defense forces, under the enemy's drones, are doing the impossible through titanic effort. Once again, I want to say that, in my conviction, none of our partners would be able to carry out such difficult tasks with such an imbalance of forces and resources in favor of the enemy. We are accomplishing these tasks, and one way or another, logistics is extremely complicated, but it still exists. Of course, unmanned systems play a major role, operating both in the air and on the ground. We use every available technological solution along the line of contact. And as for all the statements coming from dictator Putin, you and I have talked about this more than once or twice. This is a pathologically sick person, a liar who never keeps his word, and after 2 years doesn't even remember what he said, or if he does, since he's a liar, it doesn't matter to him. The value of the words that come out of his mouth means nothing to him. And for anyone who doubts my words, just look back at what Putin's position was in 2000, 2005, and 2007 regarding Ukraine. He said that there would never be a time when the Russian Federation would show any act of aggression toward the sovereign and independent state of Ukraine. But as you can see, we are now in a full-scale war. That's why we're putting pressure on Russia, and you know, right now the chair under Putin is already shaking. There are people there who used to have billions, and now they only have millions. There are those whose children live in European countries, in the United States of America, and who are just waiting for the king to stumble, one way or another. Not king, it's more accurate to say czar. They'll be very quick and eager to help him fall hard and fast. But for that, Russia needs to be dried out. Russia needs to be dried out through economic pressure across its territory, including military pressure as well. We have no other options. Once again, Ukraine is fighting for the right to live. When a person is fighting for the right to live, they're ready to take on the toughest actions to accomplish the most difficult tasks. Light.
As we can see, even the economic, what do you call it? Well, even the arguments from those around Putin don't seem to affect him. We've already talked about Putin being detached from reality. So, what do you think Pokrovsk means to Putin? Why did he put on a military uniform for the first time in a long while, invite journalists? But even then, not a single propagandist dared to go see the so-called, in quotes, Pokrovsk, supposedly surrounded by the Russian army.
You know, we'll never really know what goes on during one-on-one talks between Trump and Putin, including what they agree on, what decisions they're after, and what goals they pursue. But it's absolutely clear that all our partners act first and foremost in the interests of their own countries. It's great when the interests of states, the United States, the countries of the European Union, align with the interests of Ukraine. That's very important. Most likely, Putin made a number of commitments and assured Trump that he would achieve certain results regarding Ukraine. That's exactly why he said he doesn't intend to halt hostilities, freeze the conflict, or consider other possible outcomes of this war. And as a result, certain deadlines were discussed. Speaking about the Donetsk region, according to both insider and public information, Putin promised Trump that he would achieve success in the Donetsk region and could accomplish this by the end of 2025. But that hasn't happened. He can't capture Pokrovsk with the full might of the Russian army. That's why, for him, this is a matter of principle, so that he can have another opportunity to reach out to Trump and hold the meeting that was recently canceled by the European Union countries. That's why Russia will keep pushing and sending in new reserves, new reinforcements, some highly trained, some less so, because for Putin, this is fundamentally important. If Putin doesn't accomplish this task, and God willing, he won't have the strength or resources to do so, then, in my conviction, the position of the United States will become even tougher. And we can't fully know what exactly Trump has agreed upon with Xi Jinping, or where they found common ground. It's possible that Russia has already been divided up in terms of financial and economic influence between both China and the United States of America.
You know, Yurii, our guests on Freedom, have often said on air that the political situation doesn't affect the situation on the front as much as we might wish or imagine. Unless, of course, we're talking about the direct supply of weapons. But the situation on the front, one way or another, does affect the geopolitical situation right now, including the relationship between Trump and Putin, whatever that relationship may be. So, what do you think, since we've started this topic? What will influence Trump more? Putin's inability to make deals as such, or his failure as a person who started this war, but can't continue it?
If you're offering two options, I'd probably choose the second one. Why the second one? Because that's exactly what Putin is trying to do right now. He's trying to back up the value of his words, but it's not working out for him. For example, in Pokrovsk and also in Kapinska, and that's critically important for him, because he understands that it's the only way he can try to swing the pendulum, which has shifted toward Ukraine, back to neutrality, or even in favor of the Russian Federation, at least when it comes to communication and relations with the United States of America. That's why the military uniform, that's why the bravado, that's why the statement about journalists who are supposedly ready to come. But his loyal dogs didn't show up in either Kupiansk or Pokrovsk, because that's just physically impossible. In both cities, our troops, our defense forces, are operating and doing everything possible to identify and eliminate as many of those enemy groups that have infiltrated as they can. Plus, we also need to understand that, one way or another, no matter what kind of bubble Putin is in, he realizes that the outcome of the Russian-Ukrainian war is decisive for him. If he fails this mission, he will go down in history forever as a dictator tyrant, as a madman and a murderer, as a rapist, as a killer of the innocent, of civilians, and I'll just leave it at that. If he manages to achieve even the slightest success, he'll be able to keep rewriting history, distorting the facts, and holding on to his throne. Our task is to finish sawing off that leg of the stool, so that he comes crashing down to the ground, or, more accurately, into the ground. Plus, We also need to understand that it's the Ukrainian armed forces that give our military and political leadership the leverage to negotiate for additional support. If the front holds, if we have prospects, even if we achieve sectoral successes, we get more help. If the front is unstable, we get less help. That's just human nature. We need to understand that the major leaders of big countries are people who tend to follow the trends happening at any given moment. That's why it's so important for us to keep the line of the armed forces clear and strong. That power of the mace, with which our president receives the necessary support in the world and seeks out that support as well. And as you can see, the countries of the European Union now, more than ever, have realized just how close the war is, that it's not just happening near the gates of the European Union, as has long been said in Ukraine, but that it has already entered EU territory through violations of airspace by both Russian Federation combat aircraft and drones as well. That's why both the level of support and the number of air defense systems being provided to Ukraine have increased dramatically. We have every chance and prospect to achieve a positive outcome in this war and to preserve Ukrainian statehood. And over time, I am fully confident that we will be able to reclaim the occupied territories. Exactly how, whether by military or military diplomatic means, time will tell. The main thing is to break the strength that still remains in the Russian occupation forces and in the Russian occupation leadership as well. We
can assume that in Trump's eyes, Putin, his significance and capabilities are somehow tied to the situation on the front, particularly in the directions that are a priority for Putin, I mean Pokrovsk and Kupiansk. I'm interested in your opinion. Hypothetically, does Putin have a chance to somewhat change the priority of directions? After all, let's not forget that at one time the Russian invaders were desperately clinging to a major regional city, Kherson, and now, for some reason, Putin doesn't mention that Kherson has been deoccupied, that this was a huge defeat for them. So what do you think? How likely is it in general that this could happen? Since Pokrovsk isn't being taken, Kupiansk isn't being taken, could Putin just come up with, let's say, a different priority for himself?
It would be difficult to do, but for Russian propaganda and for a liar like Putin, nothing is impossible. Back in 1922, they said the same thing. Just look through the archives. These same questions were also discussed at one time on Freedom TV broadcasts. Putin said that their defense forces were not driven out. He said that they carried out a deliberate maneuver to regroup the forces and resources of their armed forces in order to strengthen the focus of offensive actions in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and to complete the full occupation of these areas. That's what Putin was talking about in 2022, when the defense forces drove his troops out of the Kherson and Kharkiv regions. So let's see how events will unfold. It's absolutely clear that if Putin fails, he'll come up with 1,000 reasons why it didn't work out, how to redirect forces and resources, what to say in order to keep this war going. He'll be able to justify it within the Russian Federation. Why? Because as of 2006, for those who don't know, there was unprecedented funding for Russian TV channels, Telegram channels, and propagandists. Unprecedented. The largest in the history, of the Russian Federation is being allocated to propagandists. That's why he'll be able to explain it to his own people and will try, one way or another, to fool the countries of the civilized world. But as Ukrainians, we need to understand the agenda very well. Ukrainians are educated people. That's one of our main advantages. How do you say perovega in Russian? Can you tell me how to say perovega in Russian? Advantages. Yes, that's one of our main advantages. Yes, the education of the Ukrainian nation is one of the main advantages Ukrainians have over others, including over the Russian Federation. You see how technological the war has become. You see how people are able to analyze what exactly the army needs at a given moment, how they need to act. That's why in all information campaigns, we need to clearly understand that if someone talks about a quick end to the fighting, it negatively affects the world, makes people less willing to help and impacts Ukrainian society. Because if the war is ending, then why change your way of life? Why strengthen the defense forces? Why fund the defense forces? Well, the war could end soon, right? But in the Russian Federation, this has a positive connotation. Why a positive connotation? They're men who, as we said, are stuck in microloans and payday loans, are happily signing new contracts for the Russian proxy army, hoping they'll get a signing bonus, the war will end, and they won't have to fight. And essentially, they are forming that very pool of new recruits they need, and the war doesn't end, so they send them off to fight against the state of Ukraine again. That's why I urge Ukrainians to follow the news as closely as possible from various sources, including what we're discussing on air right now, but to rely on official statements from authorized bodies, meaning the Office of the President of Ukraine, and the General Staff. They know best what the situation is on the front lines of resistance, since they have all the information. And of course, you analyze all this and make the right decisions for yourselves. Your level of education allows you to do this fully. I believe in you. I believe in the resilience of the Ukrainian nation. Yurii.
Thank you for what you do, for what your comrades do, and for joining our broadcast today. Yurii Fedorenko, commander of the 429th Separate Unmanned Systems Regiment Achilles of the Ukrainian Ground Forces, was in touch with our studio.
Subscribe to The Gaze and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.